The plate was cold by the time I touched it: roasted chicken, potatoes, a limp sprig of parsley. Oil and dust hung in the air, the smell of the garage pressing close around me. Through the thin wall, laughter spilled from the dining room, warm and bright, but not meant for me. A single strip of light cut under the door, trembling with every footstep inside. I lifted my fork, but froze when a knock echoed from the side entrance, slow, deliberate, unexpected. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Comment below. The house was still young when we moved in, the paint on the walls smelling faintly of pine and turpentine, the wood floors creaking in a way that felt more like breathing than settling. The sun in those early mornings was kind, slipping through the lace curtains in the kitchen and pooling over the table where my children sat with bowls of cereal, kicking their legs against the chairs. I remember thinking, this is what I worked for. Back then, the kitchen was my command post. Bread rose in the warm corner by the stove, and the air was always threaded with something simmering. My son, then no taller than the countertop, would climb onto a stool to watch me knead dough. His small hands would press into mine, his laughter like the soft clink of measuring spoons in the drawer. Too much flour, Mama, he once told me, though he could barely read the recipe card in front of him. Evenings were our ceremony. We didn't just eat, we gathered. My husband, before his passing, would sit at the head of the table, his calloused hands resting near his plate. My daughter set the table, my son fetched the condiments, and when everything was ready, we took our seats as if nothing else in the world mattered. There was always space for everyone. No one was left standing. The walls carried our voices. On birthdays, they held the off-key singing and the soft rustle of wrapping paper. On quiet nights, they absorbed the hum of conversation over tea. I knew every creak, every shadow cast in the hallway, and I felt held by it all. This was not just a house, it was a living thing, a witness to our small joys. When my son was in high school, he brought friends home without warning, sometimes 3 or 4 boys with hungry eyes and bigger appetites. I never minded. I'd stretch a pot of stew with more broth, slice the bread thinner, and make sure everyone left full. He'd thank me afterward, awkwardly, as teenage boys do, a quick nod, a muttered, "Thanks, Mom." But I caught the way he lingered in the kitchen, the way his shoulders softened when he was home. It wasn't until his last year of university that I first noticed the change. He came back for the summer, but he didn't spend as much time in the kitchen. He took his meals in front of the television, or out with friends I'd never met. He still hugged me goodbye when he left, but his arms were looser, his eyes wandering past me before the embrace was done. When he met her, the woman who would later become my daughter-in-law, I wanted to welcome her fully. She was polite, well-groomed, careful in her words. At first, she offered to help with dishes, though she would leave streaks on the plates and smudges on the glasses. I'd redo them quietly, thinking she'd learn over time. But there was a distance in her gaze, as though she were speaking to me through a thin layer of glass. One night, while we were clearing the table, she said, "You do so much. You should let us take over sometimes." It was kind on the surface, but the way she avoided meeting my eyes made me pause. My son was in the next room, laughing with someone on the phone. I wanted to believe her words were genuine, so I smiled and nodded. Still, the next week, I found she'd rearranged my kitchen drawers without asking. The early years of their marriage were still warm enough. They moved back into the house after my husband's death, saying they didn't want me to be alone. I took comfort in the noise again, the clatter of pans, the shuffle of slippers down the hallway. My grandson's first cries filled the air like music. But there were small hints of something changing. My belongings began to shift. A clock I loved was replaced with a sleeker, modern one, the armchair I sat in to mend clothes was moved into the garage for more space. I told myself these were small matters. I reminded myself that families grow and houses change with them. Still, I held on to our dinners. I made sure the table was set fully, every fork and glass in place. When my son came home from work, he'd sometimes bring his laptop to the table, typing between bites. She would check her phone under the tablecloth. But at least we were still in the same room. One rainy evening stands out, the smell of wet earth coming in through the open window, steam curling from the pot on the stove. My son walked in, drenched from the downpour, and I handed him a towel. He smiled then, really smiled, the way he had when he was young. "Smells like home," he said. And for a moment, I thought nothing could break what we had. I didn't know then that the space between us had already begun to widen. What I remember most about those warm years isn't the ease of them, but the way I never imagined they could end. I believed a house filled with shared meals and the scent of fresh bread could hold a family together forever. I believed my seat at the table was permanent. I was wrong. I remember the day he called me from the city, the excitement in his voice sharp enough to cut through the static on the line. "Ma, they promoted me. Office with a window and everything." He laughed, almost boyishly, and for a moment I could see him at 12 years old, running home with his first school medal in his fist. The promotion meant a bigger salary, more meetings, dinners with people whose names he dropped like fine china onto the conversation. I listened, proud and a little dazed. He had worked hard for it, long hours, extra projects, no weekends to himself. I thought, this is the moment his life truly begins. But something else began too. When he came home that first weekend after the promotion, he wore a suit that didn't quite fit his shoulders anymore, broader, more confident, as though success had added inches to his frame. He spoke faster, used words I'd never heard him use before. At dinner, he kept glancing at his phone, replying to messages between bites. "I'm sorry, Ma, it's just work," he said when I gave him a look. "These deals don't wait." I told myself it was just the adjustment to his new role. But each visit after that felt more curated. He started bringing bottles of wine I'd never tasted, describing them as though I were a client. He'd compliment my cooking, but with a smile that seemed rehearsed. Then came the renovations. It started innocently enough, a fresh coat of paint in the living room, new curtains. But soon, boxes appeared in the hallway, filled with my things. He called it decluttering. The sewing table I'd used for 30 years was moved into the garage. The family photographs were replaced with abstract prints. "I'm just modernizing the place, Ma," he said one afternoon, wiping his hands on a rag after dismantling my old bookshelf. "Trust me, it's going to look amazing." It was his wife's influence, I think. She had an eye for style, the kind you see in glossy magazines, all sharp lines and neutral colors. She rarely consulted me about the changes. Instead, I'd discover them, the floral china replaced with plain white dishes, the kitchen rug gone without a word. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself it wasn't worth making a fuss. After all, they were young, full of energy, and I was grateful for their company in the house. My husband had been gone for years, it was better than being alone. One evening, I found them in the living room with a realtor. They smiled when I walked in, but the air felt different, charged with something unspoken. I asked about it, and my son said, "Just getting an idea of the property's value, Ma. Nothing serious." But the realtor's eyes flicked to me, then back to her notes, and I knew there was more to it. I pushed the thought aside. The more my son climbed at work, the less often we ate together. Dinners became quick meals, each of us in different rooms. He started inviting colleagues over for drinks, and while they were polite, I noticed the way he sometimes steered me away from their conversations. One night, as I was bringing a tray of snacks to the sitting room, I heard him say, "She's old-fashioned. Doesn't really get the kind of work I do." The words weren't cruel, but they lodged in my chest like a stone. Still, there were moments when the old him shone through. On my birthday, he surprised me with a small cake, the kind with buttercream roses I loved. We ate it in the kitchen, just the two of us, and he told me about a difficult client he'd won over. He laughed at his own jokes, and I thought maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to the warmth we once had. But the changes kept coming. The dining table, once big enough for extended family, was replaced with a smaller one that fit the space better. My chair, the one I'd sat in for decades, didn't make the cut. He put it in the garage, next to the sewing table and boxes of old linens. I told myself it didn't matter where I sat, as long as we were together. The day they bought the new car, I noticed how he held himself differently, as if the leather seats and shiny paint reflected something about him. He offered to take me for a drive, but his phone rang before we left the driveway, and I sat there listening to him talk for 20 minutes. We never did go. There were also the invitations I didn't receive. Family friends would mention seeing him and his wife at events I hadn't heard about, fundraisers, gallery openings, dinners out. When I asked, he'd say, "Oh, Ma, it was last minute. You wouldn't have enjoyed it." And maybe I wouldn't have. But the decision had been made for me, and that stung more than I wanted to admit. The turning point came on a Sunday afternoon. I was in the garden, trimming the rosemary bush, when I overheard him on the phone through the open window. His voice was smooth, practiced. "Yeah, we've updated the place a lot. It's basically ours now." Ours. I stood there, clippers in hand, the scent of rosemary sharp in the air. He wasn't lying exactly, they had put work into the house. But the way he said it, the ownership in his tone, made something cold settle inside me. That evening, at dinner, he mentioned he'd be hosting a work dinner soon. "It'll be a bit crowded, Ma. Maybe you can have your meal in the kitchen that night." It was said casually, like a simple logistical choice. But I heard the shift, from being the heart of the home to being an afterthought. I agreed, because what else could I do? But deep down, I felt the first tremor of something breaking. I didn't know it yet, but the next chapter of our lives would move me farther from the table than I had ever been before. It began so gradually that, at first, I almost missed it. One evening, we were expecting guests for dinner, colleagues of my son's, along with their wives. The table was already set when I walked in, gleaming under the warm light of the chandelier. I noticed my place wasn't at the head or even along the sides where I usually sat. Instead, a single plate had been placed at the far end, tucked close to the kitchen door. "Easier for you to get up if you need to," my daughter-in-law said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I told myself it was a matter of convenience, nothing more. But over the weeks, my chair seemed to migrate, a quiet journey away from the center. At first, I was still close enough to hear the conversation, even join in. Then, gradually, my voice became a faint addition to their chatter, my laughter something they didn't always notice. They began to host more dinners, and I found myself excluded from the planning. The menus were discussed between them, sometimes in whispers at the kitchen counter while I washed dishes. I wasn't asked what I thought anymore, about what to serve, how to set the table, who to invite. I was simply told when the dinner would be and how many people were coming. It was during one of those evenings that I overheard a remark from my daughter-in-law. I had stepped into the pantry to fetch an extra bottle of olive oil when she said, "She means well, but it's easier when she's not involved in the prep. The guests like a more modern style." I stayed in the pantry longer than I needed to, staring at the shelves until my pulse slowed. The house itself began to change in ways that felt subtle but sharp. Family photographs that had lined the hallway, my children in mismatched sweaters, my late husband with his easy grin, were replaced with black and white prints of city skylines. My son's trophies from childhood, once proudly displayed, were boxed and moved to the garage for safekeeping. One afternoon, I came home from running errands to find the garage had been reorganized. My sewing table, my chair, and several boxes of my things were now neatly stacked in one corner, as if awaiting a destination I hadn't chosen. A small folding table had been set up nearby, with a single chair beside it. When I asked, my son said, "It's just temporary, Ma. We needed more space in the dining room for when guests come over. This way, you have a spot if you want to work on your sewing out here." I didn't tell him that the garage smelled of oil and dust, that the light was too dim for fine stitching. I simply nodded. I started to notice the way conversations would lower when I entered a room. They didn't stop speaking entirely, but the shift was unmistakable, like a song fading just as you walk through the door. When I left, the volume would rise again. Even the way they addressed me changed. My son began speaking to me as though I were fragile. "Don't tire yourself, Ma. You've done enough." Done enough of what? Cooking? Cleaning? Living in my own home? There were still polite gestures. She would pour me tea in the afternoons, though it was never quite hot enough. He would ask how my day had been, but his eyes were often on his phone before I finished answering. The sharpest moment came on a rainy Saturday. They had invited friends over, and the living room was full of the warm murmur of conversation. I stepped in, holding a tray of pastries I had baked that morning. My son glanced up, then quickly looked away. "Oh, Ma, you can just put those in the kitchen. We'll help ourselves later." I stood there for a moment, feeling as though I'd brought something unwanted into the room. I placed the tray on the counter and retreated to my bedroom. From there, I could hear the laughter downstairs, muffled through the walls, as I ate a single pastry in silence. After that, I began to take longer walks in the evenings. The streets felt freer than the rooms of my own house. I would return just in time to wash up and eat whatever was left from their meals. Sometimes they'd set aside a plate, sometimes they didn't. The folding table in the garage became more familiar. At first, I only sat there to mend things, a button, a tear in a sleeve. Then, I began having my tea there in the mornings, away from their glances and their careful words. The space was cold, but it was mine. Still, part of me clung to the hope that these shifts were temporary, that once my son's work slowed down, once the novelty of their lifestyle changes wore off, we might return to something resembling the warmth we once had. One evening, as I was clearing the dining table after a small dinner with just the three of us, my daughter-in-law said, "You should rest more during meals. You don't need to sit through the whole thing. We know you get tired." I opened my mouth to tell her I didn't get tired, that I wanted to be there from start to finish, but my son was already nodding in agreement with her. "She's right, Ma. You don't have to push yourself." And so the idea took root, that my absence was an act of kindness to myself. I went along with it, because arguing felt too much like begging. But inside, a quiet ache began to form, not just for the meals I was missing, but for the invisible seat I once held in the life of my own family. It was becoming clear that I was no longer expected to be part of their picture. I didn't yet know that the next shift would move me out of the room entirely. It was my grandson's 7th birthday, the kind of day I'd always treasured. I woke early, the air cool and sweet, and baked his favorite cake, chocolate sponge with a thick layer of ganache. The kitchen smelled like the ones from my childhood, warm sugar, melting butter, and I hummed as I worked, imagining his face when he saw it. By mid-afternoon, the house was dressed for celebration. Streamers hung from the ceiling, balloons bobbed in the corners. I could hear my daughter-in-law in the dining room arranging plates and cutlery, her voice light and efficient as she spoke to my son. When I stepped in to see if she needed help, the table caught my eye first. It was longer than usual, an extra leaf added, and every place was already set. The good china gleamed, the silverware polished. But as I scanned the arrangement, my heart stumbled. There was no place for me. I looked again, counting silently. Enough seats for everyone I knew was coming. Everyone, except me. My son must have seen my confusion, because he crossed the room quickly. "Ma, with so many people today, we thought you might be more comfortable in the garage. It's quieter there." The words landed softly but felt heavy, deliberate. I tried to smile. "The garage?" He nodded as though it were perfectly reasonable. "We've set up the folding table for you. It's just for today, the kids will be running around, and you know how loud it gets. In the corner, my daughter-in-law arranged napkins into neat fans, avoiding my eyes. I wanted to argue, to say that noise never bothered me, that birthdays were meant to be shared around one table. But my grandson's voice floated in from the backyard, high and happy, and I swallowed my protest. I told myself not to make a scene, not to tarnish his day. So I carried my cake into the kitchen, where it sat on the counter, ignored as more desserts arrived from guests. Later, I cut a slice for myself and placed it on the cold plate that had been left for me in the garage. The folding table was set with a paper napkin and a glass of water. A single chair waited beside it. I sat there listening to the muffled chorus of "Happy Birthday" coming from the dining room, my grandson's laughter pealing over the rest. I could almost picture the candles, the clapping, the warm faces leaning close to his. Oil and dust clung to the air. The bare bulb above my head flickered once, then steadied. I ate my cake slowly, trying to focus on its sweetness rather than the bitterness pressing in from all sides. The door between the garage and the kitchen stayed closed. Once, I thought I heard footsteps approach, but they passed by without opening it. After the party, my son came out carrying a plate of food. "Here you go, Ma, we saved you some." His voice was cheerful, as though this were an act of kindness. I took the plate, roast chicken, potatoes, green beans, and thanked him. He lingered for a moment, leaning on the doorframe. "I told everyone you were just resting out here." They understood. Resting. He didn't notice the untouched slice of cake beside me. When I finally went back inside, the dining table was a mess of empty glasses, half-eaten slices of pie, and crumpled napkins. The air was thick with the smell of food and the remnants of laughter. My grandson was curled up on the couch, his new toys scattered around him. He waved at me sleepily. "I saved you a cookie, Grandma," he said, holding out a small, iced biscuit shaped like a balloon. I took it, my throat tight. "Thank you, sweetheart." That night, after everyone had gone, I washed the dishes alone. My hands moved over the plates, dipping and rinsing, while voices from earlier replayed in my head, the easy chatter from which I had been absent. When the kitchen was clean, I went into the garage to put away the folding table, but stopped halfway. I realized it hadn't been folded away after all. It remained there, pushed neatly against the wall, as if ready for the next time it might be needed. And though no one said it aloud, I knew it would be needed again. Over the next few days, I noticed something strange: the dining chairs never quite went back to their old positions. Even when there were fewer guests, my seat remained close to the edge, near the kitchen. Sometimes, it was easier just to slip away to the garage before the meal began. That way, no one had to suggest it. I started bringing a small vase of flowers out there, at first to make it feel less like exile, later because it was the only space in the house that felt like mine. The flowers didn't last long in the dim light, but for a few days at a time, they made the air softer. The first exclusion was meant to be temporary, at least, that's what I told myself. But it marked a shift I couldn't undo. I had moved from the heart of the table to its edge, and now, from the edge to a separate room entirely. I didn't yet know it, but in their minds, the garage wasn't just a convenient spot. It was a quiet way of saying, "You belong here now." If your own child quietly pushed you out of family meals, would you confront them, or stay silent? The weeks after my grandson's birthday stretched out like a long, thin shadow. At first, I tried to believe the garage seating had been a one-time arrangement, an awkward solution to a crowded table. But that hope dissolved quickly. The second time it happened, there wasn't even a special occasion. My son came home from work, his jacket still on, and said over his shoulder, "We'll be having dinner with some friends tonight, Ma. Your plate will be in the garage so you can have some peace and quiet." Peace and quiet. Those words became the polite curtain they drew between us. At first, I would linger in the kitchen, waiting for the moment when the door to the dining room would open and someone would invite me in. But the door never opened. The laughter that drifted through it was warm, inviting, but not meant for me. In the garage, my world became smaller. The folding table stood like a sentinel, holding my plate, a glass of water, and sometimes a slice of bread if they remembered. I learned to eat slowly, listening to the rise and fall of voices inside, trying to guess the stories being told, the jokes being shared. Sometimes, the laughter would grow so loud that I'd have to put down my fork and wait for it to pass, like a wave that might sweep me away if I let it. The smell of oil from the tools mixed with the scent of food, creating something faintly sour in the air. I noticed the dust more, the way it settled into the cracks of the floor, clung to the legs of the chair. Even the bulb above me seemed to hum louder, as though aware of my solitude. My daughter-in-law began to speak to me differently. When she saw me in the kitchen, she'd offer a smile that felt rehearsed, followed by, "Don't worry about tonight, I've got it covered." The words were light, but they carried the same message: stay out of the way. One afternoon, I overheard her speaking to a friend on the phone. "It's just easier when she eats separately. Less fuss, you know." The friend laughed softly in reply. There were no more casual conversations while setting the table, no moments of shared preparation. My hands, once busy arranging cutlery and folding napkins, now rested in my lap as I sat in the garage waiting for my plate. On days when there were no guests, the distance remained. We no longer sat together every evening. My son often ate late, his dinner balanced on his lap in front of the television. She ate in the dining room with her phone propped beside her plate. I began to find small ways to fill the silence. I started keeping a notebook in the garage, writing down recipes from memory, making lists of the plants in the garden, sketching the old furniture that used to fill the house. The act of writing made me feel anchored, even if no one saw the pages. Sometimes, my grandson would wander in. He'd climb onto my lap with a cookie or a toy car and chatter about his day. But the visits never lasted long. Inevitably, his mother's voice would call from another room, and he'd slip away, leaving me with the faint warmth of his presence still in my arms. I tried to keep my routines. I still baked bread every Sunday morning, even if most of it went uneaten. I tended the garden, trimmed the roses, and mended clothes. But the rhythm of the household had shifted, and I was no longer part of its heartbeat. There were moments when I thought about speaking up. Once, as my son set my plate down on the folding table, I opened my mouth to tell him how it felt to be shut away from my own family. But he was already halfway back through the door, saying, "Enjoy, Ma," in the same cheerful tone he used with strangers. It wasn't just the meals. It was everything. Decisions were made without me, plans for holidays, renovations, even small things like buying new curtains. I found out about them when I saw the changes in front of me. The only time I was brought back into the main rooms was when it was useful for appearances. If extended relatives visited, I was seated at the table, introduced with warmth, and asked polite questions about my garden. But as soon as they left, I was returned to the garage, as though the performance had ended and the stage was cleared. One evening, while I was clearing my plate, my grandson slipped me a folded piece of paper. On it was a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures at a table, one of them seated far away. "That's you, Grandma," he said, pointing to the small figure. "You're in the other room." I didn't know what to say. I hugged him and told him it was a good drawing. But when he left, I sat with it in my hands for a long time, tracing the little lines, feeling the truth of it settle over me. The garage became a place of waiting. Waiting for meals. Waiting for voices to fade. Waiting for the life I'd built to feel like mine again. I began to notice that when I did speak, my voice sounded different, quieter, less certain. As if even my own words weren't sure they belonged here anymore. The distance wasn't only measured in space. It was in the way my son no longer looked me in the eye for long. In the way his wife's compliments were about things that could be bought, a scarf, a brooch, rather than anything I'd done or said. In the way the house felt less like a home and more like a place I was passing through. By then, the garage wasn't just a convenience for them. It had become my assigned place. And somewhere deep down, I think I had started to accept it. But acceptance is not the same as peace. It was Christmas Eve when the thread finally snapped. The house glowed with soft light strung along the banisters, the smell of cinnamon and roast turkey curling through every hallway. I'd woken early that morning to start the bread, 2 loaves, the way my husband used to like them, and by midday, the kitchen was a flurry of motion. Pots simmered, the oven hummed, and laughter echoed faintly from the living room where my daughter-in-law and her friends sipped mulled wine. I worked quietly, happy in my own rhythm, telling myself that even if I wasn't at the center of it anymore, I could still contribute. By the time the guests began arriving, the dining room was set with its finest. Candles flickered in crystal holders, the silver cutlery gleamed, and the scent of pine from the tree mixed with the rich aroma of food. I glanced around for my place at the table, a small flicker of hope in my chest. It wasn't there. Instead, my son met me at the kitchen door, his voice pitched low. "Ma, it's going to be a bit crowded tonight. We thought it might be nicer for you to have some space. I've set up a plate for you in the garage." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My hands, still dusted with flour from rolling dough, trembled slightly. Behind him, I saw the guests settling in, heard the polite greetings, the laughter that would soon fill the room without me. The folding table in the garage waited with its usual chill. A plate sat in the middle, turkey, mashed potatoes, a spoonful of green beans, steam curling upward like a mockery of warmth. Beside it, a small glass of red wine. They had thought of everything except me. I sat down, my coat still on. The bulb overhead buzzed faintly. From the dining room came the clink of glasses, followed by my son's voice, clear and cheerful, "To family and to the year ahead." I froze mid-bite. To family. It was then that I heard the door creak open, just a sliver, and my grandson slipped in. His cheeks were pink from the warmth inside, his small hands clutching something behind his back. "Mama said you should stay here," he whispered, "but I brought you this." He set a sugar cookie on my plate, a lopsided star with too much icing. "I wish you were inside." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I pulled him into my arms, breathing in the faint scent of cinnamon from his hair. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." He stayed only a minute before his mother's voice called him back. The door closed, and I was alone again. I stared at the food in front of me, the steam now gone, the wine untouched. My mind went back to the years when I'd hosted Christmas, when the table was crowded and noisy, when my husband carved the turkey and my children teased each other over second helpings. Back then, I never imagined there could be a version of this night where I was sitting apart, invisible. Somewhere deep inside, a line was crossed. It wasn't anger, not yet, but something sharper, something final. When the meal was over and the guests had gone, I returned to the dining room to help clear up. My son was laughing as he stacked plates, his wife gathering glasses. I began to collect the silverware, but she stopped me with a light touch on my arm. "Don't worry, you've done enough today." Done enough. I went to my bedroom instead. In the top drawer of my dresser, under a stack of scarves, was an old business card, cream-colored, the edges soft with age. It had belonged to an old friend of my husband's, a lawyer who'd helped us once when we were buying the house. I'd kept it all these years without really knowing why. Now I did. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the card between my fingers, tracing the raised lettering. The quiet of the house felt different now, not peaceful, but weighted, as though the walls themselves were watching. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay awake, replaying every moment from the past year, the gradual shift of my chair, the closed doors, the folding table, my grandson's whispered wish. The pattern was clear now. This wasn't about convenience. It wasn't about noise or space. It was about removing me, one small step at a time, until I no longer had a place in my own home. By morning, the decision had settled in me like a stone at the bottom of a river. I would call the lawyer. Not to shout, not to fight in the open, but to prepare. From that day forward, I began to watch more closely. I noticed the way my daughter-in-law handled the mail before handing it to me. I saw the way my son discussed money matters with her in hushed tones. I paid attention to the papers left on the desk in the study. I didn't tell them I knew. I didn't even change my behavior. I still baked bread, tended the garden, and accepted my place in the garage when told. But every time I sat at that folding table, I reminded myself, this is temporary, not because they wish it so, but because I will make it so. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. The day had been unremarkable, a morning spent in the garden trimming the rosemary, an afternoon kneading dough for the next day's bread. By evening, the house was filled with the smell of baking, warm and familiar, almost enough to make me forget the weeks of distance and the quiet exile of the garage. Almost. They were in the dining room together, my son and his wife, papers spread out on the table. I could hear the low murmur of their voices as I passed in the hallway, heading toward the kitchen for a cup of tea. I didn't mean to stop. But a certain word caught me in place. Sell. The word was soft, but it landed like a dropped stone in my chest. I eased back a step, close enough to hear without being seen. She won't fight it, my daughter-in-law said, her tone brisk. She's old, and she trusts you. If we present it as something in her best interest, she'll sign. My son didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was lower, slower. We'll have to make it sound like it's for her comfort. Smaller place, less upkeep. She'll understand. Understand. They kept talking, going over numbers, discussing potential buyers, even timing. The words blurred in my ears: profit, renovation, market value. I leaned against the wall, my teacup forgotten in the kitchen. My hands curled into themselves, nails pressing into my palms. They weren't just moving me to the garage for dinners. They were planning to move me out entirely. I thought of the years I'd poured into this house, every meal cooked, every wall painted, every plant in the garden placed with my own hands. I thought of my husband, how proud he'd been when we signed the papers, how he'd said, "This will be where our family grows." And now my own son was plotting to erase me from it. When their conversation shifted to something else, a reminder about an upcoming dinner, I stepped quietly back toward the kitchen, poured my tea, and sat at the table as though nothing had happened. But inside, the world had shifted. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I didn't feel anger yet, not in the loud, shouting sense, but something heavier, colder. A weight that settled deep and refused to move. By morning, the decision I had started forming on Christmas Eve was no longer a shadow in my mind. It was clear. Solid. Necessary. I pulled open my dresser drawer and took out the cream-colored business card. The print had faded a little with time, but the name was still there, steady and clear. I dialed the number, half expecting it to no longer be in service. It rang twice before a voice answered, older now, but still familiar. "This is David Mercer." "David," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "it's Margaret Lewis. I believe we met years ago, when you helped my husband and me with the house papers." A pause. Then warmth. "Margaret, of course. How are you?" I didn't waste time. "I need to talk to you about protecting my home." By that afternoon, we were sitting in his office. The place smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. He listened without interrupting as I told him everything, the slow exclusion, the garage meals, the conversation I'd overheard. When I finished, he folded his hands on the desk. "Do you have the original purchase documents? Deeds, any contracts from renovations or major repairs?" "Yes. I've kept them all." "Good." His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of steel in it. We'll start by reviewing the property ownership. If it's as I remember, your name is the only one on the deed. That will make this much easier. I left his office with a list of documents to bring him, papers I'd kept in a locked tin box in the back of my closet. That evening, while the others ate in the dining room, I sat in the garage sorting through them. My hands moved slowly, carefully, as though the thin sheets of paper were made of something far more fragile than they were. I didn't tell my son where I'd been that day. When he asked why I'd been out so long, I only said I'd gone for a walk and stopped at the library. But something in me had changed. I no longer felt like a guest in my own life. I felt like a keeper of a secret, one that would, in time, shift the ground beneath their feet. For the next week, I moved through the house as I always had, tending the garden, mending clothes, making bread. But every evening, after they'd gone to bed, I worked quietly at the folding table, organizing documents into neat stacks, labeling envelopes. It was during one of these late nights that I found a small photograph tucked between papers, my son at 10 years old, sitting at the very dining table where I was now unwelcome, his grin wide, a slice of birthday cake in front of him. I traced the edges of his face with my finger, feeling something ache deep in my chest. The betrayal had been slow in coming, but now that it was here, it felt like it had been inevitable. The difference was, I would not let it end the way they expected. What would you do if you overheard your own child planning to take your home? From the moment I left David Mercer's office, I moved through my days with a new kind of stillness, the stillness of a fox in the grass, waiting for just the right moment to step forward. Nothing in my outward routine changed. I still rose before dawn, brewed tea in the dim light of the kitchen, and spent mornings in the garden. I still baked bread on Sundays, still sewed loose buttons, still tended the rosemary and roses. But inside, every action was now threaded with purpose. The folding table in the garage stopped being a place for exile. It became my office. I cleared it of everything except the tin box where I kept our old papers. Inside were the original purchase documents for the house, receipts for renovations, letters from the bank, even the contractor's invoice from when we'd replaced the roof 10 years ago. Each sheet was proof, not only of ownership, but of the years of work and care I had put into this place. Every afternoon, I sorted, labeled, and stacked them into manila envelopes. I wrote notes in neat, careful handwriting, dates, names, brief explanations. David called once, asking if I'd found the property tax records. I had. I found more than that, photographs from the day we signed the deed, both my husband and me standing on the porch, his arm around my shoulders. Proof not only of legality, but of history. In the evenings, my son and his wife went about their lives as though nothing had shifted. They laughed over wine in the dining room while I ate in the garage, head bent over papers between bites. I don't think they suspected a thing, I had made sure of that. When my grandson visited me in the garage, I'd slide the papers into a folder so he wouldn't ask questions. We'd play with his toy cars for a few minutes, and then he'd run off again. But he had a habit now, a quick glance at the closed dining room door before he left, as if checking whether he'd be seen. I began making small changes of my own. I moved certain items, family photographs, my wedding china, into my bedroom. I told them it was to make space for more modern things, echoing their own words back to them. They didn't notice the tone. I also started keeping a small ledger. At first, it was just a list of repairs and purchases I'd made for the house over the years. But soon it grew to include overheard remarks, patterns I'd observed, and dates of conversations. Not gossip, not emotion, just facts. David had told me, facts will win this, Margaret. Feelings will only make it messy. So I wrote in the ledger without sentiment, even when my hand shook. One evening, while cleaning the pantry, I overheard them talking again. This time, it was about the timing of the sale. Spring will get us the best price, she said. She'll never see it coming, he replied. I wiped the counter slowly, forcing my face to stay neutral. They thought my absence from their table meant I was fading into the background, too quiet to notice. They mistook my silence for surrender. The irony was almost sweet. I met with David every Thursday afternoon. I told my son I was going to the market or walking in the park. In reality, I sat in David's office as he spread out the documents, reading each one with the precision of a man who had been doing this for decades. "It's airtight," he said one afternoon, tapping the deed. "Your name alone. They'd have to prove you were incompetent to make decisions in order to force a sale, and they have nothing, unless you give them something." "I won't," I said. And I meant it. At his suggestion, I updated my will, making clear provisions for the house's future, not to them, not anymore, but to someone I trusted. I also filed copies of certain documents in a safety deposit box at the bank, in case the originals ever went missing. By the end of February, the tin box in my closet was empty. Everything important was either in David's office or the bank vault. If they went looking, they'd find nothing but old birthday cards and expired insurance forms. Yet I still played my part. I accepted plates in the garage with a smile. I complimented her cooking when she served me reheated leftovers. I asked my son about his work, listened to his stories, laughed at his jokes, all without revealing that each word he spoke was being quietly weighed against the truth I now carried. And slowly, without them realizing, I began to reclaim small pieces of myself. One afternoon, I moved my sewing machine from the garage into my bedroom. When she noticed, she asked, "Wouldn't it be better out there where you have more space?" "Too cold," I said simply, and went back to stitching. Another time, when my son suggested I might enjoy staying with my sister for a few weeks, for a change of scenery, I smiled and said, "Maybe after the spring." But I knew there would be no trip, not until this was settled. The garage, though still where I ate most nights, no longer felt like a place of defeat. Every time I sat there, I imagined the look on their faces when the truth would finally be laid out in front of them, not in anger, but in the calm, inarguable weight of legal fact. For now, the plan was simple: stay quiet, stay steady, stay invisible until the moment came to stand in the light again. They thought they'd moved me to the edge of my own life. They didn't see that from the edge, you can watch everything, and prepare. Small victories are rarely loud. They don't come with applause or fanfare, they come like a quiet breath you didn't realize you were holding. The first one arrived in a thin envelope. I had been sorting laundry when I heard the mail drop through the slot. My daughter-in-law always checked it first, but that morning she was out running errands, and my son was still in bed. I picked it up, flipping through the usual stack of flyers and bills, until I saw the return address: David Mercer, attorney at law. Inside was a copy of the updated deed, stamped and recorded with the county. My name, mine alone, was printed in bold letters, followed by the legal description of the property. David had insisted I keep a certified copy for myself, just in case they ever try to claim you lost it. I held it in my hands for a long time, the paper smooth and cool against my fingers. This was more than proof. It was an anchor. No matter what they planned, the ground beneath my feet was still mine. I slipped the envelope into my bedroom drawer, behind the lining, where no one would find it. The next win came not from a document, but from an offhand remark by my grandson. He was sitting at the folding table with me one afternoon, building a tower from mismatched plastic blocks. "Daddy said we're going to have a bigger backyard soon," he chirped, not looking up from his work. "A bigger backyard?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "Yeah. Mama said we'll move to a place where there's room for a pool." He grinned, adding another block to the top of his tower. I tucked the information away. It told me two things: they were confident enough to speak of their plans openly at home, and they already imagined themselves somewhere else. That confidence would make them careless. David smiled when I told him later. The more they talk, the better. It shows intent, and arrogance. My third small win was a discovery I made while cleaning the hall closet. I found a folder tucked behind some winter coats. Inside were the realtor's business cards, printed in neat rows, along with a draft flyer for an exceptional property in a prime location. They'd already begun the marketing. Without a single conversation with me. I didn't take the folder. I left it exactly where it was, but I took a photograph of every page. David would know how to use them when the time came. The fourth victory was almost laughably simple. One evening, my daughter-in-law set my dinner on the folding table and said, "Sorry, the chicken's a little dry tonight." We had to keep it warm while the others were eating. I smiled, thanked her, and later, after they'd gone upstairs, I put the untouched plate in the fridge. The next morning, I packed it into a basket along with a loaf of bread and brought it to Mrs. Bennet, the elderly widow 2 streets over. She looked surprised when she opened the door. "For me?" "For you," I said, placing it in her hands. The way her eyes softened, the way her voice caught when she thanked me, it reminded me that I could still choose where my care went. I didn't have to pour it into people who saw me as an inconvenience. Small as it was, that choice felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. The biggest win, though, came quietly over tea in David's office. He slid a document across the desk toward me, a notarized affidavit from one of my neighbors. She'd been in the garden one afternoon when she overheard my son and daughter-in-law discussing getting rid of the old woman so we can sell. She offered it without me asking, David said. She said it didn't sit right with her. I stared at the paper, the neat black type spelling out exactly what I had known but now could prove. My neighbor's signature at the bottom was like a seal on a promise, "You're not imagining this. You're not alone." That night, I ate in the garage as usual. But there was a difference in the way I held my fork, in the way I listened to the muffled laughter from the dining room. It no longer sounded like exclusion, it sounded like noise that would soon fade. Even my posture changed. I caught myself sitting straighter, looking at the folding table not as a symbol of defeat but as a desk where I was building my case. And yet, I kept everything the same on the surface. I still smiled when my son spoke to me, still asked about his work, still nodded when she made suggestions about taking it easy. They believed I had settled into my place. The truth was, I had, just not in the way they thought. Each small win was a brick laid quietly in the foundation of something stronger than they could see. And when the time came, I would stand on it without fear. By early March, the plan was no longer just a collection of papers and quiet intentions, it was a living thing, breathing alongside me. Every meeting with David, every document filed, every fact neatly recorded in my ledger had brought it closer to the moment when silence would end. But outwardly, nothing changed. I still accepted my meals in the garage without protest. I still asked after my son's work and nodded when my daughter-in-law told me about new curtains she'd ordered for the dining room, curtains I had no say in choosing. I still tended the garden, the rosemary bush now heavy with green, its scent catching in the cool air. They believed my life had shrunk to the size of that folding table. They didn't notice how sharp my ears had become, how steady my hands were when I tucked a document into my drawer, or how my eyes lingered on the calendar hanging in the kitchen, the one that now carried a secret only I knew. The court date was set. April 17th. David had explained it clearly, "They'll try to make you seem incapable or unreasonable, Margaret. Don't take the bait. Keep to the facts. Let the documents do the talking." I promised I would. In the weeks leading up to it, there were small moments when I almost let myself waver. One evening, my son came into the garage carrying my plate and sat down across from me. He hadn't done that in months. "Work's been rough," he said, rubbing his temples. "Sometimes I think about just moving somewhere quiet. Fresh start." I looked at him, my boy, the one I'd once carried home from school when he scraped his knee, the one who used to press flowers into my hand because he thought they were pretty. For a moment, the ache of what we had lost almost pulled me toward forgiveness. But then I remembered the folder in the hall closet, the realtor's cards, the conversation about getting rid of the old woman and the softness in me cooled. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said simply. Another time, my daughter-in-law offered me a slice of lemon tart she'd baked. "Thought you might like a treat," she said with that practiced smile. It was good, tart and sweet in perfect balance. But I noticed she didn't sit with me to share it. The days passed with the same rhythm. Morning tea. Garden work. An hour or two in the garage with my ledger. Afternoon spent moving through the house like a shadow, present, but never part of the whole. One Saturday, I decided to dust the bookshelves in the living room. She was out shopping, my son in his study. As I ran a cloth along the spines, I found an envelope wedged between two large books. Inside was a letter from a prospective buyer, expressing excitement about the potential transaction. It was dated 2 weeks earlier. I took a photo of it with my phone and slid it back exactly where I found it. That evening, while they entertained friends, I ate alone in the garage. The voices inside rose and fell, laughter spilling through the walls. But instead of feeling shut out, I felt like someone sitting backstage, listening to the noise before stepping into the light. The night before the hearing, David called. "You ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be," I said. "Remember, you don't have to convince them you're right. You just have to show them you own what you own." When I hung up, I opened the small drawer where I kept the certified copy of the deed. I read it again, tracing my name with my fingertip. My husband's voice came back to me, from decades ago, "This will be where our family grows." It had grown, yes, but not as we'd imagined. I slept lightly that night. At dawn, I dressed in a dark skirt and a cream blouse, the same one I'd worn to my husband's memorial. I ate breakfast alone, the kitchen quiet. My son and his wife didn't ask where I was going when I left. They assumed, I suppose, that my days belonged to them to arrange. Let them think that. By the time I walked into David's office, the tension that had been building for months had settled into something steady and solid. He reviewed the documents one last time, then looked at me with that calm lawyer's gaze. "They won't expect you to be this prepared," he said. I smiled faintly. "They haven't been paying attention for a long time." That afternoon, I returned to the house before they did. The garage light was still on, my folding table exactly as I'd left it. I sat there with a cup of tea, letting the quiet stretch. It would be the last evening I'd eat here without choice. If you knew justice was coming, would you warn them, or let the moment hit without mercy? The morning after I returned from David's office, something in the air of the house felt altered. It began with my son appearing in the kitchen earlier than usual, his hair still mussed from sleep. "Morning, Ma," he said, and there was a softness in his voice I hadn't heard in years. He poured me tea without asking, the way he used to when he was a boy and wanted to make me feel cared for. I told myself it was nothing, just coincidence, but by lunchtime the shift had deepened. My daughter-in-law appeared at my bedroom door holding a neatly folded sweater. "Thought you might like this, the weather's turning." The sweater was my own, freshly washed and smelling faintly of lavender soap. It was such a small thing, but it carried an echo of the days when kindness flowed easily in this house. And then came the invitation. That evening, my son knocked gently on my door. "We're having dinner in the dining room tonight. Just us. Thought you might want to join." It caught me off guard. I stared at him for a moment, wondering what had prompted it. I wanted to ask why now, after months of exile. But the look on his face, a blend of hesitation and something like hope, stilled my tongue. The table was set for 3, not 6 or 8. No guests, no wine glasses lined up for show. Just plates, silverware, and the faint scent of roasted lamb. I sat in my old seat, not at the head, but close enough to see their faces clearly. We ate, and for a while it almost felt natural. My son asked about the garden. She asked about a recipe I'd once made for a neighbor. There were no sharp edges in the conversation, no pointed glances. And for the first time in months, I laughed with them. After dinner, as I washed the dishes, I caught myself wondering if this was the olive branch, if they had felt the distance as keenly as I had and wanted to mend it. The thought lingered through the night, tugging at me. If there was even a small chance for reconciliation, was it worth risking by moving forward with the court case? Could I lay down the weapons I'd been sharpening for months in exchange for something warmer, softer? The next day, the gestures continued. My daughter-in-law offered me tea in the afternoon and sat with me in the living room. We spoke about small things, the neighbor's new puppy, the weather. My son came home early from work, and we had dinner together again, this time with my grandson chattering between bites. It was pleasant. Familiar. But on the third day, the truth surfaced. I was in the kitchen, pouring water into the kettle, when I heard their voices in the hallway. They didn't see me, and I didn't move. Just keep it up until the sale goes through, she whispered. I know, he replied. But it's exhausting pretending like this. A pause. Then, lower, she's not stupid. We need her to sign without a fight. The words fell like cold water down my back. I stood very still, my hand steady on the kettle, listening to the sound of their footsteps retreating. The warmth of the past few days evaporated, leaving only the bitter taste of confirmation. It hadn't been an olive branch. It had been bait. That evening, when they invited me to the table again, I accepted. I smiled, I passed the bread, I told them about a book I'd been reading. But the softness inside me had turned to stone. Every kind word, every friendly glance, was just another thread in the net they were trying to cast over me. After they went upstairs, I sat in the garage with my ledger open, adding a new entry, March 14th, overheard confirmation of intent to deceive regarding property sale. 3 days of feigned reconciliation. The next morning, I called David. Nothing's changed, I told him. We proceed as planned. Good, he said. They're going to try to unsettle you in court. Don't let them. You already have everything you need. Over the next few days, I let them keep up the act. I sat at the table when invited, I accepted tea, I listened to stories about their plans for summer. All the while, I tucked away their words, their expressions, their timing. They were showing me exactly how they wanted me to feel, comfortable, trusting, pliable. I was none of those things anymore. The night before the hearing, my son came to my door. Thanks for joining us for meals this week, Ma. It's been nice. I looked at him, at the familiar slope of his shoulders, at the man who had once been the boy I'd raised. Yes, I said quietly. It has. And then, when he turned away, I added in my mind, and it will be the last time you get to decide whether I'm welcome. The morning of April 17th was clear and sharp, the kind of spring day where the air smells faintly of damp soil and new leaves. I woke before the sun, dressed in my dark skirt and cream blouse, and sat for a moment on the edge of my bed, letting the quiet settle around me. This was the day the waiting ended. David met me at the courthouse steps. He was holding a slim leather folder and wore the calm expression of a man who already knew the outcome. Remember, he said as we walked inside, you don't have to explain feelings. Just facts. The courtroom itself was small, the kind with polished wood benches and high windows that let in streams of light. My son and daughter-in-law were already there, sitting side by side. She wore a navy dress and that same polite smile she reserved for strangers. He glanced at me when I entered, his expression unreadable. The judge began by asking each side to state their purpose. Their lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth. My clients are concerned for Mrs. Lewis's well-being. This home is too large for her to manage. They propose selling it and finding her a more suitable residence. I could feel David straighten beside me. When it was his turn, he rose and handed the judge a folder. Your Honor, this is the original deed to the property, showing sole ownership under my client's name. Also included are tax records, renovation receipts, and photographs documenting her continuous residence for over 30 years. The judge flipped through the papers, nodding slowly. Their lawyer tried again. We're not disputing her current ownership, but rather her ability to maintain the home. Our concern. David cut in smoothly. Your Honor, my client has managed this home without assistance until recently, when my clients here began systematically excluding her from its use. I have sworn statements from neighbors and friends who witnessed these actions. He laid the affidavits on the table, each one a neat brick in the wall we were building. I watched my son's jaw tighten. My daughter-in-law's hand twitched in her lap. The judge read one statement aloud. She told me they were going to get rid of the old woman so they could sell. The words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my voice steady. I didn't mention the garage, the folding table, or the loneliness. I simply said, I have lived in that house since my husband and I bought it. I planted every tree in the yard. I have paid every bill, made every repair. I am capable of continuing to do so. David handed over the photographs, my husband and me on the porch with the "sold" sign, my children playing in the yard, the renovations I'd overseen. Facts, just as he'd told me. Their lawyer asked the judge to consider the emotional strain my staying in the house might cause the family. The judge looked at him evenly. The only emotional strain I see documented here is on the part of the homeowner, who has been isolated in her own property. The ruling was swift. The house was, and would remain, mine alone. No sale could proceed without my express consent. Furthermore, the judge ordered that any interference with my right to use the entire property would be grounds for legal action. It was over. My son didn't look at me as we left the courtroom. My daughter-in-law walked quickly, her heels clicking against the tile. Outside, the sunlight felt warmer than it had in months. David clasped my hand. You did exactly what you needed to do. They didn't see it coming. No, I said softly. They didn't. When I returned home that afternoon, the house felt different. Not warmer, not yet, but freer. The garage door stood open, sunlight spilling across the folding table. I walked past it into the dining room, pulled out my old chair from the corner, and set it back in its place at the table. I didn't wait for them to return. I sat there in the quiet, my hands folded on the polished wood, and let the stillness soak in. If you had just taken back what was yours, would you stay in that house, or walk away? 2 weeks later, I hosted a dinner. It wasn't grand, no polished speeches, no rows of wine glasses lined up for show. Just roast chicken, fresh bread, a pot of rosemary potatoes, and a lemon tart cooling on the counter. The kitchen was warm, the air rich with the smell of herbs and butter. At the head of the table, I placed the chair that had been in the garage for months. I ran my hand over its worn arms, the wood smooth from years of use. My grandson sat beside me, chattering about school, his legs swinging under the chair. Across from us, David Mercer smiled politely, listening, his plate already half cleared. The dining room was bright with evening sun, the light catching in the glassware, reflecting off the silver. Every place was filled, but not with those who had once tried to edge me out. My son and his wife had not been invited. This table was for people who saw me, truly saw me, and wanted to sit in my company. The garage stood empty now. I had swept it clean, rolled up the thin mat that had been under the folding table, and opened the windows to let the dust drift out into the spring air. Where the table had been, I placed a large pot of geraniums, red, full, and alive. As the evening went on, I caught myself leaning back in my chair, listening to the murmur of voices, the clink of cutlery, the occasional burst of laughter. There was no edge to it, no need to guess what was being said. I was part of it, as I had always meant to be. Later, after the dishes were done and the guests had gone, I stood in the doorway of the dining room, looking at the table in the soft glow of the overhead light. My chair sat where it belonged, steady and waiting. I thought of the months in the garage, of the cold plates and closed doors, and felt no urge to dwell there again. This was my home. My table. My seat. And I knew, with quiet certainty, I would never eat alone here again.